The topic of this lecture is the moral theory known as utilitarianism. Utilitarianism will be the first major moral theory that we'll be taking a look at in this course. So far in this course, we've seen a number of ideas about morality that just really aren't going to give very satisfying answers about what it is that really makes something moral or immoral. We've seen some ideas that are very often occur to folks, but that for a variety of reasons just aren't going to work. If you've not seen yet the lecture titled The Map of Moral Theory, you should certainly do that first. But if you have, know that this is the part that we're in. We're going to be taking a look at utilitarianism. Again, utilitarianism is the first major theory we're going to take a look at that really has something of a reasonable explanation for what might actually make some things morally correct and other things morally incorrect. Utilitarianism, as a moral view, has three elements to it. That is, there are three distinct ideas that when you combine those ideas, they give you the overall moral theory of utilitarianism. Those ideas are called consequentialism, hedonism, and the sum totaling and maximization of well-being. Consequentialism is the view that consequences, right, are all that matter to morality. Hedonism is the view that pleasure is the only intrinsic good and pain the only intrinsic evil. And the sum totaling and maximization is the sort of decision procedure that a utilitarian goes through in order to determine what things are morally correct and what things are morally incorrect. Again, each of these ideas is independent from one another. They are different ideas. It's just that when you combine them, you get the overall moral theory known as utilitarianism. So let's take a closer look at each of these elements of utilitarianism so that you can see how it is that this theory actually works. First, let's consider the idea of consequentialism. What I want you to imagine is there being a couple of different buttons, right? Now, all by itself, pushing a button seems to be totally morally neutral. But now imagine the buttons are actually connected up, right? Button 1 is a button that when you press it, it gives some child a candy, okay? And you know, don't worry about any nightmare scenarios, right? The child doesn't have any food allergies. The candy is perfectly fine, ordinary candy. You've got their parents' consent, everything like that. Just it's a standard case of yes, you're going to make a kid happy. Right. Button number 2 gives a kitten an electric shock. It does no permanent damage to the kitten, but it certainly causes the kitten pain, and who would want to do such a thing? So a few things to realize about this situation. Pushing a button all by itself, like just the action of, like mashing something down with your finger, that all by itself, that act is morally neutral. But you think it's good to press button number 1, the button that gives a child candy, and you think it's bad to press button number 2 because of what happens when you push the button. It's not the act of pushing the button that makes the difference as to whether it's a good act or a bad act. It's what happens after you do it. Okay? And so it's what the button does that establishes its moral status as a good thing to do or a bad thing to do. And that's the idea behind consequentialism. That's all that consequentialists say. They say that it matters what happens when you do an act. And in fact, consequentialists take this idea as far as it will go. Consequentialists, consequences, again, they do seem to matter to morality, but consequentialism is the idea that consequences are perhaps all that matters to morality, that that's all there is to it, is what happens when you do an act. What makes an act good or bad is what happens when you do it. Okay, that's consequentialism, and all by itself, it's a major idea in morality, but again, it's just one part of the utilitarian moral theory. But all utilitarians are consequentialists. Right? Not all consequentialists are utilitarians because they may not adopt these other views, but all utilitarians are consequentialists. They all have subscribed to the view that what makes something moral or immoral is what happens when you do it. The second major idea that is involved in utilitarian moral theory is this idea of hedonism. Now, there's already a separate lecture on hedonism and some of its beginnings. Of course, hedonism by itself is not a full moral theory. Hedonism is a theory of well-being, right? It's a theory of what makes a person's life go well for them or not. And so it's part of utilitarian theory, classically, but it's not, again, hedonism isn't by itself the same thing as again, some hedonists are utilitarians, not all. Classical utilitarians are hedonists. Okay, so hedonism is the view that, as stated in the earlier lecture, that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, pain is the only intrinsic evil. And so where this fits into utilitarian theory is as follows. It is obvious, right, that good consequences are good in some sense, right, and that bad consequences are bad in some sense. But what actually makes some consequences good and other consequences bad? What explains the goodness of versus badness of what kinds of consequences? That's what hedonism is for. That's the role it plays in utilitarian theory. It's the view that pleasure, okay, and I should point out many utilitarians use the word happiness, okay, is the only intrinsic good, and that pain is the only intrinsic evil. Okay. Whenever a utilitarian uses the term happiness, whenever it's used in the reading in this unit, think pleasure, right? Happiness is not sort of happiness and pleasure mean the same thing for a utilitarian, because the utilitarians that we're reading here are hedonists, right? They believe that, again, pleasure is the only intrinsic good, pain is the only intrinsic evil. And so wherever consequences, okay, whenever consequences cause more overall pleasure, those are good consequences. When consequences cause more overall pain, those are bad consequences. Right? That's the role that hedonism plays here. It helps to separate what makes one consequence good versus another consequence bad. Good consequences are consequences that are pleasurable. Bad ones are consequences that are painful. Either not just for the person doing the act, right? It's for everybody. But that's the last idea that we're going to be getting to as an element of utilitarianism. Okay. So before we talk about sum totaling and maximization, the Phronesis text mentions a kind of thought experiment that's owed to a philosopher by the name of Robert Nozick, called the experience machine. Okay, and the experience machine is supposed to be a kind of objection against hedonism. It's supposed to be a thought experiment that's going to reveal that something might be wrong with the idea that pain is the only intrinsic good, or sorry, pleasure is the only intrinsic good, and pain is the only intrinsic evil. The way that it goes is as follows. Imagine there's a machine and that you can step into the machine and push a button, and it'll be kind of like The Matrix, if you've seen that film, and create this sort of whole world that you sort of live in, and it's a world of maximum pleasure, right? It's the world that, as it would be if it was the most pleasurable possible existence that you could live, okay? And it's completely convincing. You really can't tell the difference. And of course, Nozick says, are you going to walk in there and push the button or not? Most people say not, and so Nozick says there must be something wrong with this idea that pleasure is all there is that makes something good, and that pain is all that can make something bad. That's the view. That's the objection. And again, it's an objection to the hedonist view of well-being. It's a very famous objection. Okay, it's probably the first and objection that you'll hear, and I'm glad the textbook mentions it and discusses it. It's my view that the experience machine objection is misguided. Okay. The point is, I don't believe that it shows that pleasure is unimportant, right? Rather, I think that this thought experiment only shows that we prefer living in reality to living in a fiction, right? Because when you ask people, say, well, look, what's wrong with the pleasure? And you're like, oh, it's not the pleasure I object to, people will say. It's the idea that it's all fake, that it's all false that they object to. Right? And so consider a counter thought experiment. So instead of a machine that will give you, that when you push the button, it'll make you believe that you're living the life of maximum pleasure. Imagine a magic button that when you push it will actually make everybody live their lives of maximum pleasure, that will actually fundamentally change reality in such a way that all of the pain and all of the suffering and all of the hurt that isn't necessary for anything, that doesn't help anybody grow, that doesn't help anybody appreciate the good times, right? And all of these, like good, great things that we want for all of our all of the people we love and all of the people we don't even know actually really happen to them. Like all of the good things that really can happen do happen. Would you push that button? I mean, I think the answer would be yes. Yes, I think we should punch a button that would actually let everybody live the best possible version of their life in reality. So when you take this idea of the fakeness or the fiction out of it, all of a sudden, I think that, I don't think we find there any problem living a life of maximum pleasure. It's just that we do find there, a problem with living a life of fake maximum pleasure. And so I think, again, the thought experiment is a little misguided. I don't think it actually refutes hedonism so well as many people think it does. But it is worth noting that there are theories of well-being that are not hedonistic, right? There are some legitimate, there's a lot of legitimate philosophical discussion about, about well-being, and there are other theories. For example, the desire satisfaction theory. This says it's not pleasure and pain that makes somebody's life go well for them. It's having their desires fulfilled, right? Keeping in mind that not every desire that you fulfill is necessarily all about pleasure, right? There might be many kinds of desires that you have that if they're fulfilled, they don't necessarily give you any pleasure, right? Or at least it's not the pleasure that really leads to your life going well for you. There are also views known as objectivist views that might say, look, pleasure is one thing that's important in a good life, but there are many other things that are not pleasure that are also important for a good life. And the objectivist view is whatever list you come up with of which of those things are really important. And pleasure may be one of them. Pleasure is probably one of them, but not the only one. Okay, so there are objections to hedonism. It's not hands down the only possible theory of well-being, but in this course we're not really going to spend a lot of time talking about competing theories of well-being. But the reason we discuss hedonism to such a great extent is because it's so important, especially to classic utilitarians. Right, so know that there are controversies here about hedonism, but again, it's not a major focus of this particular course. Okay. All right, so the final of those three ideas that make up utilitarianism is this idea of sum totaling and maximization. All right. So the idea, again, behind utilitarianism is to try and anticipate the consequences of every action available to us and total up then the amount of pleasure and pain, and then get some kind of a score for each action. Okay, so again, the idea is when we talk about sum totaling, right? We want to sort of, again, total up the amount of pleasure and pain for each action available to us. So say we have, 3 different options or something like that. In reality, there's often more, but imagine you've got 3 options, right? So, okay, well, if I do this thing, if I do option 1, then, here's how I anticipate my act to affect everybody who will be affected by it, including myself. And then action 2 will affect everybody who's affected by the action, in a certain other set of ways. And then option 3 will have some other set of effects. The idea is, again, to total up all of the pleasures and pains that are caused by each of those possible actions, right? And you get a kind of score. That's the sum totaling aspect of things. And then what you do is you pick the one thing, right? The one act that has the best overall balance of pleasure and pain, like the best total in that sense, and then that's the one you pick. That's what we mean by maximization. And of course, a major question then is, how do we total all that up, right? How do we, how do we add up all those different pleasurable and painful consequences, right? Well, to help us answer this, we're going to enlist the help of one of utilitarianism's greatest advocates, the great British philosopher Jeremy Bentham. He lived from 1748 to 1832, but this is a photograph taken of him in 2012. And if you're paying very, very close attention, you'll notice that 2012 is a long time after 1832. And so that this is a picture of him many, many years after his death. Before you say, well, that, must be like a picture of a statue of him or a model of him. No, it's actually him. These are actually his remains. And this is one of the things I absolutely love to talk about whenever, sort of Bentham comes up, because it's just so interesting. As it turns out, at Bentham's own request, he was actually publicly dissected for science, right, at a meeting of the world, so like in front of an audience, he was dissected for science, and then had this what's called an autoicon. That's what when you make something out of the remains of a person, that's what it's called. I bet you didn't know there was a word for that. It's called an autoicon. Okay, created by padding his skeleton with hay and dressing it in his clothes. The head was mummified, okay, and these days, over time, it does not look particularly lifelike. So this particular display has a wax head with some of his actual hair. And so his actual bones are in there, and his actual hair is on the head. The face is sort of waxen. You can look on Google or whatever for Bentham's head, and it's kept in a separate place. And again, it does not look particularly lifelike. It looks like any other mummified head if you've ever seen mummified remains. But in any case, that's Bentham. And actually, I guess before really moving on away from this autoicon business, imagine, people put all kinds of weird things in their last requests. Like they make weird requests of others, and it's a real testament to how much people must have respected Bentham that he asked for all these ridiculous things and then they actually did it. Right. A lot of times when people ask for things that are really ridiculous in their last requests, we'll do those things if they're not too ridiculous or too onerous. But the things that are just like way ridiculous, we tend to ignore and be like, well, they're dead, right? But they actually did all these things for Bentham. So anyway, okay. So I want to address a sort of terminological issue in the text, something that I feel like might cause a great deal of confusion, and I want to try and head that confusion off at the pass, as the old cliche goes. So in the Phronesis text, it talks about Bentham's version of utilitarianism, and it says that it is as follows. It says it is consequentialist / teleological. These are words that are two words for the same thing. It is relativist, it is maximizing, and it is impartial. Okay. Notice that's slightly different than the list I said earlier about what constitutes utilitarianism, but it sort of is and isn't. Okay, so first off, if we want to deal with this first thing, all utilitarian theories are by definition consequentialist. Okay, all of them are maximizing and all of them are impartial. Right, and of course, all of them are relativist in the sense that the text means here. This is the thing I really wanted to clear up. By relativist, the text means, and this is a quote from the text: Bentham's utilitarianism is relativistic rather than absolutist. Absolutist moral views hold that certain actions will always be morally wrong, irrespective of context or consequences. So what they mean by relativist here is they mean non-absolute. And relativist isn't usually the word that people use to mean non-absolute. Usually they just say non-absolute. Sometimes they'll instead use the term flexible rather than relativist. And that's to avoid confusing the term with its use in, say, for example, moral relativism, which we talked about earlier, and we dismissed it as a bad theory. And so we don't want to say, we don't want to give the impression that Bentham is somehow a moral relativist. He is not, right? Not in the sense that we talked about earlier. Again, the sense in which the text authors, the authors of Phronesis, are using the term relativist here, what they mean is non-absolutist, okay? And that's not, again, that's not, it has nothing to do with moral. Okay, utilitarianism is an objective moral theory because it says that it's people's actual pleasures and actual pains that are actually caused by actions that make something right or wrong. Okay, that's entirely objective, right? That's not relative in any way to anything. Right, pleasures really exist, pains really exist, and their totals really exist. Okay, and they're not just a matter of whatever some group happens to think they are. That's not the sense of relativist we mean here. And so I will tend to, when I talk about this aspect of utilitarianism, and it's not just Bentham's utilitarianism this way, it's pretty much all of them. They are all flexible. Okay, I'm going to use the term flexible rather than relativist, again, because I think using the term relativist here just confuses it with its other usage and leads to, again, potential troubles. So don't confuse that action. Think flexible here. Think non-absolutist, right? And so you might say, okay, what do you mean by flexible or non-absolutist? Well, okay, we'll get there when we get there, but I just wanted to address that terminological concern here. All right. So we're going to go back to that question that we raised a couple slides ago of how do you total up all of these pleasures and pains? And this is what Bentham really contributes to utilitarian theory. He gives us this really nice breakdown of just how you total up pleasures and pains to determine what kinds of actions are morally good and what kinds of actions are morally unacceptable, right? And so, again, for each option available to you, for each thing you could do, what you should do is you should total up all of the prospective pleasures and pains as follows. Here's how he puts it. He says you should total up the intensity of each pleasure and each pain. Each pleasure is going to give like some sort of a positive number. Each pain would get something like a negative number. And if you're having trouble saying, well, how do I give pleasures and pains a number? Well, I mean, in a way, that's what they ask you to do when anytime you walk into a clinic talking about a pain, right? They show you this little scale that's pictured here, and they'll say, what's it like, right? And for the most part, people give reasonable answers. I mean, there's some variation, right, in how people sort of rate one thing versus another, but in general, like if somebody's coming in with a paper cut, it's like a 2 or a 3, right? And somebody's coming in with a kidney stone, it's a 10, right? I mean, it's absolutely the worst. So it's it's reasonable. There's again some individual variation, but that doesn't mean that the whole system is not workable. We generally have a pretty good idea what we mean by higher numbers and what we mean by lower numbers. If you put it on a reasonable scale, you're going to get a pretty reasonable distribution. Such things are useful enough to be diagnostic, right? That even doctors can rely on them with reasonable accuracy. But again, we know what we mean by intensity of pain or intensity of pleasure. Some pains are much more painful and some pleasures are much more pleasurable than others. That's what we mean by intensity. And so each pleasure and each pain has an intensity score that can be attached to it. And when you do something, when you do an act, you're going to cause more than one thing to happen, right? And so you have to total up all of the pains and all of the pleasures that are the result of your act, not only for you, but for everybody who is affected by the act, right? And so that's what we mean by this hedonistic calculus. And so one thing you have to total up about each of those pleasures is how intense each one is, and all the pains. How intense are each of those pains? More intense, right, is is better for a pleasure and worse for a pain. Okay, that's what we mean there. And then you want to figure out the duration, okay, of each kind of a pleasure or a pain. And again, each of your actions, each of your possible acts will cause many more than just one pleasure and one pain, right? They'll cause lots of pleasures and lots of pains, and each of them probably have a different duration. But again, you have to total it all up. And so a really intense pleasure lasting a very long time is going to be a lot better, right, than a sort of mild pleasure lasting a brief time, okay, and that's still going to be better even than a pain, a really intense pain that lasts a long time or something like that. That'd be the worst, okay. And so the longer lasting the good pleasures, the better off, right? The shorter the pains, the better, and that's what we mean by, again, duration. It's pretty standard, but again, each pleasure and each pain has a duration. It's not that each act causes some duration of something. Each act has lots and lots of consequences in terms of pleasures and pains, and each of those pleasures and each of those pains lasts for however long it lasts, and you have to keep track of that, because pleasures that last longer, all things being equal, are better, and pleasures that last less time or are shorter in duration are, all other things being equal, worse. And then finally, because we're dealing with anticipating the future, we can't do that with exactitude, okay? And so you have to say, all right, well, how likely are each of these various pleasures and pains to be? Because it's not like we know the immediate future. We say, well, okay, if I do A, then this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen to everybody affected, right? Rather, you say, well, here are the things that are likely to happen, although there's a possibility of this other thing, right? You might have two actions. You say, well, action A, most likely will end up being a reasonable benefit to most people, but has some small chance of total disaster for enough, right? Whereas action B is not so good for anybody, but there's no chance of a disaster. Maybe option B would be the better one. So again, certainty, right, of each of those pleasures or pains, of each of the possible consequences of your actions, the more likely things are going to be the more important things. That's what you're going to be focusing on. Right, so you're going to be weighting all these pleasures or pains and all the scores that they have based on how likely it is that those things really will be caused by one act or another, right? And here's a fun word. This is a word you can use to impress your friends. It's called propinquity. Okay. And it's the only English word that means what it means. Okay, it essentially means nearness in time. Okay, and so imagine that you could have the choice between something really good happening to you tomorrow or having that same really good thing happen to you in 10 years. What should you pick? Well, most people will pick the one that's tomorrow, right? Because all things, other things being equal, if the event is equally good now or 10 years from now, you may as well just have it sooner, right? I mean, and so that's how propinquity tends to add value. Things that are sort of nearer in time are more important to us than things that are further in time, more distant in time. In fact, think of it this way. Imagine that somebody says, okay, if you loan me $5 today, I'll give you $10 next month. Okay. What basically you're asking is whether the $10 next month are going to be as valuable to you, given that you'll have to wait for it, as $5 are to you right now. Okay. Now, some of you might say, yeah, I'd take that deal, whereas others would say, nah, I wouldn't take that deal. And again, assume that you really do, this is a completely trustworthy person here who will absolutely, do what they say. And most people will, honestly. The idea is that there's a sense in which, okay, as I say, okay, fine, so instead of paying you $10 next month, how about if I pay you $15 next year, right? And that might be a deal you would take, and it might be a deal you wouldn't take. You might say, it's just not really worth going without that $5 for an entire year just to get the 15, or something like that. And the idea is you can actually do all kinds of surveys of people to figure out how far in the future things sort of get discounted, right? And in fact, this chart on the right here is a chart indicating sort of common responses in terms of what people call propinquity indifference. That's what the economists who study this sort of thing call it. Right, and the idea is that there's a sense in which something's being far enough out into the future, it has to be a super big reward before we'll consider that more important than even smaller rewards that are much nearer to us. And Bentham sort of saw this as a part of human nature. He thought that people really do value things that are nearer in time than things that are further away in time. So things that are like short-term consequences in general are going to be more weighty than long-term consequences, unless those long-term consequences are really significant. Okay, and that's what we mean by propinquity. So all of your consequences, some of your consequences are nearer term, some of them are sort of middle term, and some of them are long-term consequences. And in general, the short-term consequences have a little bit more weight. Okay, and so that means that if long-term consequences are going to be important, they're going to have to be pretty significant compared to the short-term consequences. Right? And so that's propinquity. That's how that factors in to a hedonistic calculus. And then finally, the fecundity, right, of each pleasure or pain. Now, fecundity is, again, one of these fancy words that means that it has a tendency, it means the tendency of things to produce more like themselves. Okay? Again, it's the only English word that means what it means. So when you call something fecund, right, it is something that has a tendency to produce things like itself. Okay, it has a tendency to produce more of the same. And so as you see here, rabbits are a great example. We say that they're very fecund, right? They have a tendency to produce more of the same. Okay, and so the idea is that some kinds of pleasures have a tendency to produce more pleasures. Okay, so for example, think about if you've ever gotten into a hobby or a craft or an art or something like that. I mean, the process of learning is sort of fun, right? Of sort of figuring things out, of sort of messing up a little bit, and then trying to sort of learning from that process. That's kind of fun, and it's a kind of fun that sort of brings more fun, because as you get sort of better and better, you sort of get to push yourself, you get to continue to learn more things, and you get to sort of continue to sort of build this pleasure of having so much time and effort, and to see your skills improving, right? That's a kind of pleasure that brings more pleasure along with it. right? And so, by the time, say, you take up painting a little bit, and you're sort of fiddling around, and eventually you're able to paint like Bob Ross, right? And you have nothing but happy accidents, and happy little trees living all over your paintings. It's super pleasurable, right? I mean, and again, it's a sort of pleasure that just brings more pleasure along with it. And so fecund pleasures are much better than pleasures that are just sort of one-off, right? They're oh, that was nice, and then now it's over, okay? And of course, some kinds of pains are very fecund pains, right? They're a pain that just brings more pain and suffering along with them, and those are much worse than the pains where it's just like, well, it's bad and then it's over, okay? And so, again, when you think of the consequences of your actions, you have to think about whether you're causing the kinds of pleasures that will end up bringing more pleasure, and that's good, right? Or whether you might be causing the kinds of pains that just bring more pains and suffering, and that's really bad. Okay, and so you have to think about the fecundity of each of the pleasures and pains that your actions will cause, and not just the pains or pleasures themselves in terms of intensity or duration. Okay, if this isn't complicated enough yet for you, there's a couple more elements here. You also have to consider the purity of the pleasure or the pain, of each pleasure and each pain that you end up causing to each person, right? And by purity, we mean to say that, again, Bentham recognizes that actions aren't simply either just pleasurable or painful. Okay, so consider something like a vaccination, for example. If you've gotten, if you've had to have a tetanus booster, if you stepped on a rusty nail or something like that, there's some soreness, right? There's pain immediately. That they have to stick you with a needle. It hurts a little bit, and sometimes there's a little bit of soreness thereafter. But if you think about that pain in comparison with having tetanus, right? It's way, way worse to actually have tetanus, okay? And so this is one of those things that's not purely pleasurable nor purely painful, right? It saves so much suffering, and yet it does cause some pain, right? Exercise, for example, is one of those things that's is very impure in the sense that it's painful and unpleasant, and otherwise more people would do it more often. There's the thing that keeps most people from exercising is that it sucks, and so. But it's not pure suck, right? It's one of those things that you really do feel better. You do get healthier. There is a lot of pleasure that goes along with that, along with all of that pain, right? There's that sort of the oldest exercise slogan in the book is that no pain, no gain, right? And so lots of actions in life are not purely pleasurable or purely painful, but there's a kind of balance of pleasure over pain or pain over pleasure that occur in those actions. And so things that are more purely pleasurable are better than things that are more purely painful, right? And so again, each of the consequences of your actions, every effect that your act has is going to cause pleasures or pains for people other than yourself and including yourself. And each of those pains will have its own intensity and duration. Each of those pleasures will have its own intensity and duration. And those consequences will each have a different certainty, each have a different propinquity, each have a different fecundity, and each have a different purity. Right? But if you're adding all these things up, you're adding them all up, and that's all of the things you have to think about in figuring something like this. And finally, there's one more, and that is the extent. Okay, the extent of the pleasure or pain is how many people are affected in that way. Okay, and so if you do one act that affects a small number of people, right, then that act has a low extent, right? If you have an act that will affect a large number of people or will cause a particular pain for a large number of people or a pleasure for a large number of people, then that pleasure or that pain has a large extent. Okay, so extent refers to the number affected, okay? And again, including yourself, but also including everybody else. Right, and again, everybody counts as one for utilitarian theory, right? Everybody's pains and pleasures are equally weighted. Okay, they're all considered. And so again, when you have several options, you say, all right, how much pleasure and how much pain is each of these options causing overall? And that's going to be a function of the intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent of every pleasure and every pain that each action that you could take would generate. Right, now notice that sounds like a lot, right? And it is, but it's thorough, right? I mean, if we're going to think, if we think that our actions are supposed to generate the best possible consequences, right? The idea is that what we want to do is we want to do that which brings about the best possible world, right? The best possible situation. Well, yeah, it's going to be complicated. The world's complicated, right? Welcome to life. And so I want to say that based on this hedonistic calculus, there are a lot of ways in which people have tended to misunderstand utilitarianism, and so some objections to utilitarianism are not very good. They're not very well thought out. They don't understand the theory very well, and there are some ways in which it's really easy to misunderstand the theory or to misunderstand what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to think about it. Okay, and so one of the most common, and in fact, this is brought up in the text to my slight annoyance, is that it says the objection that utilitarianism says to do whatever benefits the majority, right? And this comes from formulations when people say something like utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number, and that's not exactly accurate, right? The truth is a little more detailed than that, and I'll just say here that that yes, I'm taking issue with the textbook. I think the textbook is not perfect. No textbook is perfect. I think that the Phronesis text does some things very, very well, and does some other little tiny things in ways that sort of annoy me. So I'm going to tell you in which ways in which those annoy me. But keep in mind, there is no perfect book. There is no book that's going to make me maximally happy. Even a book that I wrote, I would say, I think other people would say, that I would say some silly things in there. It's inevitable. So it's a perfectly good book, but there's a couple of things I do want to take issue with, and this is one of them. Okay, this idea that utilitarianism says to do whatever benefits the majority. That's not true. Okay, and no utilitarian would actually say that whatever benefits the majority is fine. So usually you'll get these sort of facile counterexamples where people say, well, look, if 51 people in a society would just be made happy by killing the other 49, then that's what the utilitarian would say to do. No, they wouldn't. Okay. It's untrue. Again, in some cases, it might be actually much better to choose a large benefit to a minority over a small benefit to a majority. Okay, so that happens often enough, right? If there's lots of people imagine lots of people in a society don't care at all if things are a particular way, but a small number of people really, really care if things are a certain way. So, for example, I suspect that you and I mean, depending on your experiences, I think most individuals could exist perfectly well without various kinds of handicap accessible things like curb cuts and automatic doors and things like that. But for those people that really benefit from those things, and actually lots of people benefit from time to time, like when you're carrying a heavy box, boy, that automated door and those curb cuts are sure nice. Okay, they really do benefit everybody, but they benefit some people an awful lot, and those people are a kind of minority, right? And so it makes sense to choose a substantial benefit to a minority, right? Even over, right, something that might be more convenient for a majority, right? But if the majority didn't care a whole lot, but the minority cares a whole lot, right, or it would affect them a whole lot rather, then the balance is actually in favor of the minority in this case, right? So here's it's just not true that utilitarianism always says to do whatever benefits the majority. It does not result in a tyranny of the majority. That is not a legitimate objection to utilitarian theory. Also, if you think about examples like where the 51 are made happy by killing the 49, you have to consider all of the misery that's accompanied with being sort of killed, right? That in this whole situation. And a utilitarian is really going to say, no, everybody has to choose the option that will lead to the best overall consequences. And I can think of something that has better overall consequences than 51 people killing 49, and it's 51 people not killing 49. That has better consequences. So again, that's what the utilitarian would command, not the other way around. So this idea of utilitarianism being a tyranny of the majority is not it's not right. Okay. And so another kind of misunderstanding is that we must always choose whatever creates the greatest happiness, right? And again, that's not exactly right either. Okay, usually the way I put it is the best overall consequences. Okay, something that generated very great happiness and very great misery might be worse, right? Would be worse than something that produced a little happiness and no misery. Okay, and if you see like the purity part of the hedonistic calculus, that's what sort of addresses that basic idea. And so you don't have to choose whatever causes the greatest happiness. It's whatever causes overall the best balance of pleasure over pain. Okay. And so, again, those are two ways in which people tend to misunderstand utilitarianism, by thinking either that it's a sort of majoritarian view, which it is not, or that it's some sort of, sort of take the best happiness. It's like, well, no, take the best overall consequences once you've also factored in the pains. Okay. And so the textbook raises some very common criticisms of utilitarianism. But I wanted to take this moment to say that we're going to be taking a look at some very serious criticisms of utilitarianism. And so here I'm going to take a look at some of the less serious criticisms of utilitarianism. Next week is when we're going to be taking a look at some of the more serious criticisms. But I want to say here that the fact that utilitarianism generates criticisms is not because it's a bad theory, it's because it's a good theory. Right? The kinds of criticisms that we saw of, say, moral subjectivism or moral relativism or of the divine command theory, basically there's one or two really big problems with those views that just sort of blow those views out of the water. We don't really have anything like that with utilitarianism. We have some things that are very seriously concerning about it, but that the utilitarian always has some reasonable response to. Okay, and the reason why there are so many criticisms of utilitarianism is because people are taking it seriously enough as a moral view to bother devoting the time to criticize it. Okay, so the reason we're going to be taking a look at a lot of these criticisms is because utilitarianism is a good enough theory to talk about these criticisms for, rather than to simply say, here's the big problem, this is why we just aren't utilitarians, right? Which is certainly something we could do earlier in the unit, but not so much with utilitarianism. And so here's one of those criticisms. It says, if the morality of our actions depend on their consequences, then we just won't know whether something is moral or not until all the consequences play out. Well, that's true, right? That's just a true thing about utilitarianism and about any consequentialist moral theory. It is that we won't know what's moral or not until all the consequences play out. But of course, that's no reason to believe that morality does not depend on consequences, and it's not a reason not to try to bring about the best overall consequences. Right? That's just, a fact of reality. So for example, if a theory could only be a correct one if everybody knows everything, well, then no theories will be correct because nobody will ever know everything. And that's, again, it's not a real objection here. It's a pretty weak objection, because of course, it doesn't give us any reason to believe that morality doesn't, in the end, depend on consequences, right? It doesn't give us a reason not to try and do the best we can, right? Bring about the best consequences. So here's another criticism. And in the text, they talk about the example they use is somebody who tries to foil a robbery and in the process, an innocent person is shot, right? Versus they say, imagine that person, instead of trying to foil the robbery, had tried to dive under the nearest table and then ended up, sort of knocking over the assailant and allowing them to be caught peacefully without any further harm. It seems like the second situation had much better consequences than the first situation. But that seems absurd to say that he did the right thing in trying to save himself and did the wrong thing in trying to save everybody else, right? And trying to keep people safe. So this is what they call the problem of wrong intentions in the Phronesis text. Now, this is somewhat more reasonable, but again, it's not a very good objection to utilitarianism, and here's why. The utilitarian can respond this way. They say, look, it's just improper to mix up whether an action was right and whether it was praiseworthy, because those are two different things. If it didn't accomplish the best outcome, it was not the right action. And I don't think anybody could deny that, right? I don't think anybody could deny that the outcome where some innocent person was shot was worse than the outcome in which no innocent people were shot, right? I think that's very clear, right? But I also think it was very clear that the action to try and save people was praiseworthy, and the action to simply look out for oneself was not so praiseworthy, okay? And those are just two different things. Whether an action is right or wrong is not the same thing as saying whether it was praiseworthy or foolish. Think of another example. Imagine that somebody has a choice of putting some of their savings into the stock market, and there's one particular stock that it's run it's a really sort of shoddy company that is sort of run by people that are sort of known for not knowing what they're doing, and there are all kinds of financial irregularities, and they're peddling a product that's very unpopular and low quality, and whatever. I mean, like, imagine there's all the evidence in the world for saying that this company is not going to succeed, and then there's some other company that all the evidence in the world points to that the fact that they will likely succeed. Now, it would be absolutely foolish to bet on the first company than the second, right? To put your money into one place rather than the other. But imagine through some sheer dumb luck, right, the really high quality company run by really high quality individuals, ends up, going bankrupt, and the really crappy company ends up getting sort of bought out by some better outfit sometime later, and, going sort of bananas and making a lot of money in the stock market. You don't deserve praise for doing the dumb thing, even if the dumb thing worked out well in your favor. Right. And so again, there's a difference between whether an action ends up well, has good or bad consequences, and whether or not the action is praiseworthy or not. Most often, we praise the kinds of actions that are most likely to generate the best consequences, but we have to concede that something that's most likely to generate the best consequences won't always do so. Right? And that we have to separate those two things. And that's what the utilitarian does. They say there's a difference between actually generating the best consequences and doing that thing that probably should have generated better consequences, even if it didn't. Okay. And so the thing about the utilitarian is they're never really going to let you off the hook for the actual consequences you really do cause, and intent is not going to be worth really anything to you, to a utilitarian. Right. All right. So here's a further criticism. Okay. Someone might say, look, utilitarianism requires too much calculation to be realistically useful. And you might think that this is a really good objection, given how complicated the hedonistic calculus is. And you might be like having to go back and watch that section a couple more times and say, gee whiz, how do I make sense of that, right? However, again, this is also not a particularly strong objection to utilitarianism. And here's why. First, the utilitarianism is intended to be a criterion for rightness, okay, rather than an action guiding principle. So Bentham is trying to answer the question, what actually makes some consequences better than another? And he gives the hedonistic calculus is a really, really excellent answer to that question. What actually makes one kind of a situation better than another? He says, well, see, in this situation, you have this many pains that are this intense, that last this long, and that are this certain and this close in time, et cetera, right? And in this other circumstance, you have this different blend of, pleasures and pains and whatever, and you can see that one of them is clearly better than the other. That's a really great way to answer that question. That's what the hedonistic calculus is for. It's for saying what actually makes one situation better than another, so that we can, have that clear in our thinking. Right? And second, most decisions don't require that kind of vast calculation. Right. So, I mean, imagine you're walking down a hallway and there's some other people in the hallway. They're walking the other direction. Notice you probably don't ever have to stop and think to yourself, gosh, do I kick everybody in the shins as I walk down the hallway, or do I not kick everybody in the shins? Well, let's see. How many shins are we talking about here, and how intense is the pain of being kicked in a shin, and how likely am I to hit them as opposed to their dodging away, and like how many of them am I, et cetera, all that. You don't really have to go through the hedonistic calculus and answer that question. In fact, you probably don't even have to ask that question. You just walk down the hallway, you don't kick anybody in the shins, right? And so again, most decisions, the vast majority of decisions people make in their everyday life, it's obvious which kinds of decisions will generate more pleasure and more pain than others. Okay. But not all decisions are that way. And for the decisions that are not that way, the ones that are really kind of close, the ones where we're really not sure what the overall effects of our action will be, well, the more time we can spend thinking in detail about the consequences of our actions, about how our actions really are likely to affect as many other people as we can think of, probably the better. Right? I mean, the closer our decision-making approaches the hedonistic calculus, probably the better. And again, we don't always have the time, but that doesn't mean that a more detailed decision is going to be isn't going to be better than a less detailed decision, right? So again, this isn't really an objection to utilitarianism so much. In fact, John Stuart Mill, who was sort of the next generation defender of utilitarianism after Bentham. In fact, Bentham was his godfather. Mill writes this way against this very objection that he saw people, say all the time. He says, again, defenders of utility often find themselves called upon to reply to such objections as this, that there is just not time previous to action for calculating and weighing the effects of any line of conduct on the general happiness. This is exactly as if any one were to say that it's impossible to guide our conduct by Christianity because there is not time on every occasion on which anything has to be done to read through the Old and New Testaments. Right? And again, so he makes a useful metaphor here. Again, in order to guide your life by Christian principles, you don't have to read the Old and New Testaments every time you think about doing something, right? Again, a lot of decisions are easy, but if there's a decision that's really hard, spend as much time as you can, perhaps carefully reflecting on what you ought to do, right? And that's, again, the analogy, I think, is a pretty good one. All right, so those are some, like I said, some fairly facile criticisms of utilitarianism. They're not real criticisms. They're mostly just misunderstandings of the theory and how it works. But before we get to some more serious trouble for utilitarianism, because there are some very serious criticisms that utilitarians really should take seriously, most of those we're going to take a look at, sort of for the next week. For our purposes here, I want to highlight what sorts of things really actually attract people to utilitarianism. What's really good about the moral theory? Because I think people sometimes, and I think the Phronesis text in particular, jumps to the criticisms of utilitarianism a little too quickly, right? I think we should appreciate why this is such a good moral theory, why it's worth thinking about and generating objections to. And here's what people tend to like about it, right? Number one, people tend to like the impartiality of utilitarianism, right? And so what we mean by that, what impartiality means in the context of utilitarianism, is that everybody's pains and pleasures are equally counted, right? Everybody counts as one, right? Nobody's pains, nobody's pleasures are any more important than anybody else's. Your pleasures or pains are not important than somebody else's. Theirs are not important than yours. They're equally weighted, right? And so if a particular event causes lots and lots of pleasure, it kind of doesn't matter whose pleasure that is or how that pleasure is distributed. Lots and lots of pleasure is lots and lots of pleasure. If an action causes lots and lots of pain, it doesn't really matter whose pain it is, whether it be yours or somebody else's, or even if that pain be human, for goodness sakes. The text mentions something that's pretty well known for Bentham. Bentham thought that animal pain is just, it's pain. It's pure and simple. Pleasure is pleasure, pain is pain. It all has to count, right? And that's actually one thing that people really like about utilitarianism. They say, look, we're not going to worry about whose pain or whose pleasure. Nobody's more important than anybody else. We're just going to look at the total, right? What kind of acts have greater total pains and pleasures? Which acts of yours can make the world as good as it can be, and which of your actions are not going to make the world as good as it can be? Choose the ones that are better in that sense, right? Choose the ones that have the higher overall totals of pleasure over pain. Right? So that's impartiality. And second is flexibility. Remember earlier, the text calls this sort of, like relativism or something like that. Again, what they mean is flexibility. And so utilitarians will not actually say that a certain type of action, for example, lying, is either always wrong or always right. Right? It depends on what actually happens once that action is taken. So imagine, this is a common, a common example that's used to illustrate this effect. Imagine that you're in World War II and that you're hiding, a family of Jews from the Nazis, right? And some SS people, they come and knock on your door and say, "Are you hiding any Jews in here?" Right? What are you supposed to do? Tell them the truth, right? Because again, it seems like the truth has far worse consequences than a lie in this case. And so a utilitarian is going to be flexible about that. They're going to say, well, look, it's not lying that's right or wrong in and of itself, just like it's not pushing a button that in and of itself is right or wrong. It's what happens when you do it. Right? And so each individual lie, it has to be judged by what its consequences are, right? And if telling a lie really produces the best possible consequences out of any other option available to you, well, then that's what morality requires of you, right? Whereas, look, most of the time, things like murder, things like theft, things like lies, most of the time, those things generate worse consequences than other available actions, which is why we tend to think of them as bad things. But utilitarianism is going to be flexible. It's going to say, well, it really depends on what actually happens in the actual situation. There may be actual instances of theft or lying or even murder, right? That if they produce the best possible consequences of any other action available, then that's what morality requires. And so that's something actually that a lot of people like about utilitarianism, is its flexibility. And then finally, its demandingness. Okay. Utilitarianism makes a ruling on each and every action, no matter how small, right? Every action has consequences and is one of a number of possible actions that could have been taken, right? And again, that's something that people tend to like about the moral theory. They like a moral theory they can apply in every situation. And utilitarianism certainly is that, because every action has a consequence and because every action is one of a number of possible actions that could have been taken. Utilitarianism will say something about every situation, right? That it's very demanding in that sense, right? That it actually sort of, says something about every aspect of daily life, as people think a good moral theory ought to. And then finally, it includes a pretty expansive moral community, right? People tend to like that about utilitarianism. They say, look, anything that can feel pleasure or feel pain should be considered. And this includes animals, children, and adults with severe mental handicaps, right? It doesn't require that, people have a certain understanding of morality to be considered by morality, right? For example, we don't think that, when we say good dog or bad dog, we don't tend to mean morally good or morally bad. We don't think dogs have an understanding of morality. But we think it's wrong to walk up and kick a dog for no reason. Why? Well, because it causes the dog pain, right? And pain is bad. And if you do something, right, you want to cause as little pain as possible. You want to cause as much pleasure as possible. And that's the basic insight of utilitarianism. That's all that a utilitarian asks of you, is just to do that which causes the most pleasure and the least pain of anything that you could have done. Right? And that's a way of really actually making the world better. Right? Again, the utilitarian is never going to let you off the hook for the consequences. It's a consequentialist moral theory. So again, these are all things that people really, really like about utilitarianism. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of a spoiler and say that once we start looking at some of the big criticisms of utilitarianism, I will say this: utilitarianism will sometimes be criticized for being too impartial. Right? That's one of the things we'll end up, taking a look at some point. One of the things we'll actually take a very close look at is that some people think that utilitarianism is too flexible. Okay, so the people who like utilitarianism really tend to like its flexibility, but the people who really dislike utilitarianism really dislike its flexibility. And so we'll talk about things like the problem of justice, right, that applies to the flexibility of utilitarianism. And finally, we'll the demandingness of utilitarianism is as follows. Some people really like how demanding it is. Other people think that is what makes it a bad moral theory, that it's too demanding. And we'll examine the demandingness of utilitarianism next week as well. And of course, some think that it's perhaps, includes too wide of a moral community. Right? But in any case, that's those are some of the things that people really do like about utilitarianism. That's one of the reasons it has been, for quite a long time, one of the major moral theories that gets discussed and thought about. And so last thing I want to leave you with is a brief note about something that the Phronesis text addresses, known as Rule Utilitarianism. Okay, and so when people object to utilitarianism, when they say, oh, there's not enough time, or oh, it's too flexible, it allows you to do things that we normally consider to be bad, like lying or stealing or even murdering or something like that. I think torturing is a very common example people use. And they will say, instead, let's replace normal act utilitarianism, that is, do the action which has the best overall consequences. Let's replace that with a different formulation. Let's instead say, do the thing which, as a rule, that means sort of most often, would lead to the best overall consequences. So if you're thinking that way, you're thinking in terms of what's called rule utilitarianism, right? And Rule utilitarianism has seemed very tempting to a lot of people because it escapes some objections to act utilitarianism. It says that, oh, well, look, now we no longer have to say that things like lying or stealing or something like that are sometimes okay, and in fact sometimes even morally required. And then we no longer have to worry about spending so much time, because really you say, oh, we can remember a short set of rules a lot easier than we can sort of do the full hedonistic calculus or something like that. So again, it seemed very tempting, right, as a way of sort of escaping some objections to utilitarianism. However, I think this is really a blind alley, and I would sort of encourage you not to waste too much time going that way. And there's two big reasons for that. One is that it makes morality about following rules rather than bringing about the best consequences, right? One of the things that makes utilitarianism what it is that consequentialism, that idea that what actually happens when you do what you do matters, okay? And rule utilitarianism backs off from that. It says, oh, well, what matters is that you follow the rule, not about what actually happened when you did it, right? And so to retreat to an example I used just a few minutes ago, again, imagine you're in that cottage, and you're hiding the family of Jews from the Nazis who are trying to exterminate them. And the Nazi says, are there any Jews hiding in there? And imagine you're a rule utilitarian. You have to say, well, because lying usually causes the worst consequences, I guess I have to tell the truth. Even in this case, where telling the truth obviously has the worst possible consequences. Right. So again, it gives up on rule utilitarianism, that is, gives up on some of the things that make utilitarianism the kind of theory that people like. It makes it less plausible, right, as a theory of morality. It gives up what's really best about utilitarianism. And so if you're going to be a rule utilitarian, you should just come up with some different reason why following the rules is good in and of itself, because it gives up on consequentialism. Here's the other problem. It's that if you had to think about rules, like some set of rules, well, the act utilitarian has a pretty good rule for you. They can say, well, look, you can bring about the best overall consequences by just following one rule. And that rule is do that, right, which always brings about the best overall consequences. There you go. There's your one rule, which basically means you're doing exactly what an act utilitarian would do, which is every time you act, think, okay, which of my available actions has the best overall consequences? Do that one, right? And so, again, rule utilitarianism simply devolves into act utilitarianism if you have the right set of rules. And it seems like only one rule would actually generate the best consequences all the time, and that is the rule, do that which generates the best overall consequences. So again, it's something. Rule utilitarianism is tempting, but it's a bit of a blind alley. And again, the text spends a lot of time describing it, but I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope that that's there. Much better to simply if you find yourself really persuaded by utilitarianism, much better to simply accept it and study it and say, yeah, it has some of the quirks that it has some of the concerns that it has, but if you think that the responses that utilitarians can make to some of those objections are reasonable, then make those objections, then make those responses. So there you go. So that's utilitarianism, and have a good time with it. One thing I will say at the end here is when you're doing your discussion board assignment that asks you to apply something like the hedonistic calculus, don't, again, think the hedonistic calculus doesn't, you don't just say, oh, let's look at, two choices I have and look at the intensity of each choice, right? Choices don't have intensity. Consequences have intensity. And every choice you make is going to have more than just one consequence. It's going to have lots of consequences. And each of those consequences is going to involve some kind of a pain or some kind of a pleasure for some number of people. And so don't try and overly simplify it. Don't treat these things as independent, right? I mean, the intensity and the duration, for example, of a pain are both important to that particular pain. Intensity by itself doesn't do anything, and duration by itself doesn't do anything, and fecundity by itself doesn't do anything. These things are all dependent on each other, right? So again, don't be too simplistic. That's a big mistake that people tend to make with utilitarianism, because whatever else it is, it's not simplistic, right? The basic ideas behind utilitarianism are very simple, but in practice, it is anything but simplistic.